Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, we're going to look at the new Dungeon Master's Guide cover for both their main and alternate versions. I'm going to talk about a chat I had with the designers over at Elderbrain on adventure design and adventure building. I'm going to dive into a topic that we've discussed before, which is whether or not actual play games are hurting players' expectations. I actually have some data on this topic we're going to dig into. And our main topic today is going to be talking about leaving blanks. How do we leave areas of our RPG open, layers of our story open, so that the players can use their imaginations to fill in those blanks and build a story even more fantastic than we could have in our head? And we're going to cover more questions from the May 2024 Patreon Q&A, all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, here to talk about all things in tabletop role-playing games. This show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, and tools to help you run your games. They get access to the awesome Lazy RPG community over on our Discord server. They get access to the monthly Q&A, but most of all, they help me put on shows like this. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your outstanding support. So this past week, it's kind of a quiet news week, and a couple of things that came out. One is that there is a new cover release for the Dungeon Master's Guide that has Vecna on it. Okay, so you get to feel however you're going to feel about it. I feel how I'm going to feel about it. I'm kind of like, okay, whatever. I do think it's interesting how much they're throwing into the nostalgia of the old school. And I do wonder if you were to take 20 current D&D players and ask them, hey, who is that? How many of those 20 would know who it is? Now, your answer might be, who cares? If they don't know who it is, it's still a cool, weird demon dude with one horn. Isn't that special? Right? But I bet you nobody could name who that person on the left is. That's certainly, and there. Anyway, it's clear that they're trying to tie it into nostalgia, but so what? So I was like, I had here's my opinion, the shrug emoji. Okay. That's fine. It didn't really grab me. It didn't grab me like the Player's Handbook one did. I kind of like the Player's Handbook original one. But, hey, neither here nor there. The cover is the way the cover is. We each get to have our own opinions. We can, we could all discuss whether or not the kind of diving into the nostalgia of the old D&D is really where things should go. But guess what? It ain't up to us. It ain't up to you. It ain't up to me. It's not our responsibility to make the entire tabletop role-playing game industry hum. We can just decide how we want to decide. So I'm like, it's, whatever. It didn't really grab me, but whatever. And then I saw the alternate cover. I was like, oh, look at that alternate cover. Right? Oh, like, Happy Loth mummifying somebody looks really cool. So once again, I get to the oh man, got to get those special edition covers because the special edition covers look really cool. There's probably 1,000 posts on EN World about how you feel about the various covers. And I don't know how much it matters to me. I like the Acererak cover. I wonder if I'm just getting to be of that age where I like the old one. I like the old 2014 book covers. I still think they look really good. And I don't know that I like the new ones better than I like the old ones, but that could be me more so than what's going on there. But I definitely dig these special edition covers, and I'm going to definitely pick those up. This past week, so I had talked about Torrents of the Spell Hoarder on the last talk show, and the fine folks from Elderbrain reached out. They listened to what I had to say, and they said, hey, how would you like to get together and talk about adventure design in general, making high-level adventures, making adventures overall? And I said, sure, I'll do that. So this past Friday at 8 a.m. my time, I got on with the two folks from Elderbrain, and we had a really fun chat about adventure design. So you can find a link to that chat in the show notes, an hour and 34-minute chat that we had talking about adventure design, adventure building, what we think about it. I will warn you, I have a great big rant against the Vecna Eve of Ruin in this one. I didn't even bother to talk about it on the talk show. I did talk about it with them. So I think that it is just fine. Oh, they did spell my name wrong. That's fine. Yeah, S-H-E. I don't care. So anyway, it was really fun. So if you want to hear me talk more about adventure design, you want to hear me rant about Vecna Eve of Ruin, or you want to hear any of the talks, and you want to find out more about the processes that we go through when we're making the products that we're making, this is definitely a nuts and bolts, how the sausage gets made kind of chat that I had with the two fine designers over at Elderbrain. Really, really fun guys and really fun chat. So you can find a link to that in the show notes. So this past week, a friend of mine over on one of my many Discord servers brought up a post that had been posted on X from somebody who was describing a situation that their child had, where their child came home and said that they had been running a game that they had been preparing for a lot, and they asked for feedback from their players, which all sounds good, and they didn't really have any feedback. And then somebody said, well, that's not how Matt Mercer would have done it. And I don't think the tweet got a ton of attention or anything like that, but it brought up the question that my friend brought up the question. He said, I'm not really into the whole idea that like actual play games are hurting our games, right? He wasn't really talking about that, but he was saying like, are actual play games building a different expectation about what the games should be like at our table? And I think in particular saying that like, was the situation getting where there was more attention being put on the game master to kind of fill out a deep and rich story that the players wouldn't have to bother to bring to the table, which I don't think is really accurate either, because I think the players in actual play games bring tons of stuff to it. But I thought like, well, it's an interesting question. It's come up before. The Matt Mercer effect, it's often referred to. Like, is there this false expectation of the way that GMs should be based on what Matt Mercer does or based on what actual play does? Now, Brendan Lee Mulligan is also doing a whole lot of stuff like this. And they're very highly produced, $1 million studios, hundreds of thousands of people viewing them, tens of thousands of people buying tickets to go watch them play live. Is that building a different expectation for the individual games that we have? And it's kind of easy to sort of jump on that and be like, oh my God, woe is us. People have this false expectation. And I generally have been like, no, it's not. But then I was like, well, how would you know if that was the case? Like, this is the question I asked my friend. I said, how would you know if that's the case? How would you know if things were really, if that was steered in the wrong direction? Like, how would you be able to track that, right? How would you be able to see it? And I think that I talked to my friend about it too, but I also talked to some other people about this past week, and including one person who has a boatload of data on this actual topic. And that's why I think we're going to talk about today, is because the boatload of data has some really interesting points. And the question, I think like one way you could say that would be an obvious way, is if players had a greater expectation on their GMs about the games they're running, they probably wouldn't play in as many games if they weren't being met by that expectation. They might show up to a game, say, wow, this sucks, I don't like it, and then not play, right? Which would mean, if that were truly the case, I think you would have kind of one of two potential circumstances. There's probably other ones too, but you might have one of two potential circumstances. One would be that players are not having as good a time, but continue to play, or they'd stop playing. Now, the second one is kind of measurable. And the way that you measure it is you say, are DMs having trouble finding players? So far, my understanding from everything I've read, everything I've heard, every experience I've picked up is, generally speaking, it's far harder for players to find GMs than it is for GMs to find players. Now, it might be hard for GMs to find good players that are consistent, that show up on time, that are running the same kind of game. That can be pretty tough. But generally speaking, what we've always heard is that there are far more players who want to play than there are GMs willing to run games. And what that results in is many times GMs become GMs by necessity. They sort of become GMs because they want to play and no one will be willing to run it, so they run it. The last time I did a poll on this topic, I don't know, I had hundreds of people that answered the poll, and the majority, the highest number of the highest reason why somebody became a GM was because nobody else would. That was why people generally became a GM. So where do we get the data from this? Well, I have another friend of mine, David Christ. David Christ runs the organized play games for Baldman Games. He runs Baldman Games. Baldman Games is, I'm pretty sure, the largest organization of organized play D&D games in the world, and has been for a long, long time. And he runs games at conventions all over the world. He runs tons of conventions in the United States throughout the year, and he runs he organizes tons of online games. He manages I asked him, I said, about how many GMs? And he says, we're probably tipping 1,000. So he has 1,000, he's run 1,000 game masters. He's run hundreds of thousands of players. He's run, tens of thousands of games over the years, including like thousands of games a year. And he has some insights into this, and he also surveys the players on all of these games. Now, it's very easy to say, yeah, but organized play games are very different from home games, which is absolutely true. And organized play games are also very different from actual play games, live play games, streaming games, and stuff like that. So you could say like, well, that data is not exactly accurate because of that focus that it has. I actually argue that organized play games are a really good thing to look at as a benchmark, because organized play games are so very different from actual play games. Because organized play games, and most often in organized play games, the GM doesn't know who the players are going to be. The GM doesn't know who the characters are going to be. Many times the players don't know who the other players are going to be. There's a tight time restriction on it. You're usually set to a slot and you have to finish the game in that slot. And many times the GM has to run tons of different games. So they're kind of tired and they're running it for a bunch of different groups. So they're not running like a home group where they know the players, they have all of their stuff. And then third is they're often playing at conventions where they have limited resources. They have to only have what they can carry with them. They're not usually bringing, everything that they have to be able to run a game. They're usually bringing whatever they can fit in a backpack to get onto a flight. So I think that when you consider the restrictions that are in place for organized play games, they are far more restrictive than you would get for a home game. And since they're more restrictive than you get in a home game, you would think that because they're so different from actual play games, that the players who are going to these organized play games and playing at them, who have an expectation or have experience with actual play games, would be much harder on them. So that would mean that Dave would have more players who are not playing. He would have more people who are unhappy with it, those two circumstances. They're playing, but they're not happy, or they're not playing at all. So I asked him, are you having trouble finding players for games? And his answer was no, we're still saturated on players and we never have enough GMs to be able to run games. So all of this time that we've had organized play games, he, in running all these online games and conventions and stuff like that, always has more players than he has GMs willing to run it. So that's one data point. Then data point number 2 is he does give a poll on this. And one of his polls is, would you recommend this GM to somebody else, is one of the questions he has, kind of a general satisfaction one. And he said that over the past, I don't remember exactly the time period of this, but I don't think it was too selective. Generally speaking, his satisfaction scores are 92%. That players, by and large, are very satisfied with the games that they're playing at organized play games. And those games are far more restricted than what home games are able to do. So I think that you can definitely, I think that those two data points kind of tell me that at least when it comes to comparing organized play games to actual play games, the Mercer effect isn't as strong. Players are still just wanting to play. So those are two important data points. But I think there's a third, which I think probably matters more than any of that. I think the data, from me, I don't, and good, if you have better data than that, better data than 100,000 games worth of stuff, please let me know, because I don't know where you can get that kind of data that Dave's got. And I get it's 100,000 games in a very select 10-year period since 5th edition has come out, but mostly at organized play games. I did ask him, well, how many of those are new players compared to players who have played continually and understand organized play? Because I've definitely met people where when they're playing organized play games, it's almost like it's a different kind of player. It's almost like a different game. And it's because they're very aware of all of the kind of boundaries and restrictions and rules and adventures that make up organized play. And they only play organized play. They don't play in home games. And that the system of organized play is like having a whole separate version of the game that they play. I've met them, and and I'm not degrading them. I think that that's an interesting way to enjoy the hobby, is that it's really a whole separate community. But he said that's really at some of the older conventions that's true, where if you go to like Winter Fantasy, if you go to some of the smaller, older conventions that he's been running for a long time, you'll find the same set of players who show up who play that particular game. And of course, they're going to like it. They've been doing it for 10 years. But he said, no, by and large, the majority of players that he's getting at his games are new players. They're people who have not played before or played only infrequently, and they're coming, and it's the first time that they've played in organized play games. And so they would have that experience of having seen actual play games and bringing the experiences that they've seen. And when we talk about actual play games, we're really talking about like maybe 5 different ones, because 99% of the actual play, the audience of an actual play game are watching Critical Role or Dimension 20 or maybe a handful of others. It's not every other streaming game, right? There's a huge power curve in the audiences of streaming games that really say that they're probably the top 5 streaming games are dominating. I'm making this up, but I bet you it's true, that the top 5 online streaming games account for 99% of the viewership. So it's really those games that you're talking about. So I feel like that is a decent comparison to make that brings up 2 data points. One is that there's no lack of players. There is a lack of GMs. And 2, that players who are playing are generally satisfied with what they're playing, right? They're enjoying it. But that doesn't matter to you and it doesn't really matter to me. What matters to you and me are how our players feel about it. The players that are actually at your table, the players that are actually at my table. As GMs, we don't have to worry about what every other player thinks, unless all we play is organized play games, in which case, and then we're having new DMs, new players showing up at our table every time. Then you might think about it more. But if you're running home games and you're running for a group or multiple groups where you know the players, then the question is, what do they want? How do they feel about it? Do they, and then you might have a player who says, wow, I really wish the game was more like what we're seeing on Critical Role, or I really wish the game was more like what we're seeing on Dimension 20. And that's something you want to talk about. That's something you want to investigate, because we do want to run great games for our players. We don't have to fix all of the players in the hobby. We don't have to fix all of the GMs. We don't have to worry and pontificate about whether or not players overall their minds are getting bent by watching all the $1 million organized or actual play games. No, we only have to worry about the players that are coming to our table. And that we know who they are, and we know what they want, and we know what they focus on. Well, how do we know what they want? Ask them. Talk to your players about it. Talk to your players about what they want. Talk about what they like. Use stars and wishes. What did you enjoy about the game that you just played, and what are you hoping for in the future? Very simple questions that you can have about how to really understand what your players are interested in. You want to know more about what your players want? Talk to them about it. Ask them about it. Ask them about the kind of styles of game that they enjoy. If you're bringing new players on, ask them about that. Ask them about the games they really enjoyed and what they really enjoyed about it. Ask them about the kinds of games that they really want. But talk to your players to find out. It really matters. Now, what if your players are coming with a great big expectation about the way the game is going to be that's different than how you run it? You can make that clear as well. This is a great time for your session 0. You say, hey, this is the style of game I'm considering running. This is the kind of GM that I am. This is what I'm able to do. And this is what I'm not able to do. And if you have somebody who says, like, I have 36 pages of backstory of my character and I really want that integrated deeply into the campaign, you could say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to do that. That I also have 5 other players who I'm running for. And if everybody brought that, I wouldn't be able to do that kind of integration. I'm really sorry. But I can do my best to try to tie into little aspects of your characters as it relates to the campaign. And what you can do for me is build your backstory around the campaign that we're running. So you can kind of do sort of a back and forth, and listening to what they want doesn't mean you have to say, I'm going to do all of that stuff. Instead, it's your opportunity to manage expectations, right? Hey, by the way, I'm not going to be able to run the kind of game Matt Mercer runs because I'm not spending 8 hours of prep time for every 4-hour session. But here's what I can do. Here's how I can focus it. And then you can say to yourself, because again, I think a lot of what it comes down to when we think about what players really want is it's really nice when you're paying attention to their characters, right? That's really beneficial. So spend more time trying to think about the characters. Think about how you can integrate their characters in the story. Think about how you can bring their backgrounds in. And also ask them to try to help build their characters around the story of the campaign, how they can better support other characters that are there, and do some of that work themselves. Those conversations, I think, can really help. And that way, we don't have to worry about what's happening to the hobby and what's happening to the community and our players overall having their expectations of what D&D is going to look like or what our RPGs are going to look like is being bent because they're watching $1 million live streams all the time. I don't think that this is the problem we think it is. I think players, by and large, are happy to play. Not all of them. And sometimes you're going to get a player where their expectations of what they want for the game are not going to match up with how you run a game. I've had this happen in my games. We've had hard conversations with players where I said, I really don't think I'm going to be able to run the kind of game that you really want to play in. Right? And we had to have that conversation. And I think that is just sometimes what needs to happen. But it isn't a matter of trying to do it for everybody and worrying about everything. Also, what are you going to do? Stop streaming games? Good luck with that, right? How are you going to fix this? There's no opportunity to fix it. So what can you do? Talk to your players, set expectations, maybe try to understand a little bit more about what kind of GM you are. Now, I also think that there's an advantage in being able to watch live play games and pick up some tips from it, because some of those live play games really do interesting things. It's an opportunity to watch GMs who are at the top of their game running awesome games. And sometimes you get some ideas from that. And I think some of those good habits can rub off on you as well. So I wouldn't throw away streaming games. I do think a lot of the worry about the Mercer effect really just comes down to like, well, I don't really like streaming games. And it kind of bothers me about how much of an impact they've had on the hobby. I think that's probably where a lot of this anxiety is coming from. And then they're turning that into, well, this could be building false expectations in players, and now the game is getting ruined. And there's just nothing to support that. And in fact, to me, the data that I'm able to look at, the data is the opposite of that. So I think that as GMs, what we can do is learn from everywhere and focus on our own games and focus on our players and focus on our own way that we run our games and try to make those games as fun as we can make, regardless of anything else that happens. But I thought that was an interesting topic. I have this draft article that I've been kind of like skimming through. I'll probably publish this at some point, but I think that I think it's an interesting topic to kind of cover. And the whole hobby is evolving. Organized play is evolving. The D&D is changing and evolving as we go. And live play games are changing as we go. So I think that this is the kind of topic that we can come back to and kind of benchmark and say, have things changed? Are there things that we can do? What can we do? How has the hobby changed? I think those are healthy conversations to have from time to time. So I was happy to have this conversation. Patrons of Sly Flourish get access to lots of cool things. And one of the things that patrons get is they get to see all of my experiments and things. I'm constantly trying weird things out. Weird ideas come to me. And what I really love about the community that we have with the Sly Flourish Patreon is I can try this stuff out. I have people who want to take a look at this stuff. They get to see all of the zany, mad experiments that I get to work on. And I get people that can look at it and tell me, no, that's totally stupid. Or, no, that's kind of interesting. Or what if you did it this way? They get to see lots of stuff super early. And people who are on the Patreon, the Sly Flourish Patreon Discord server, get to see it even sooner, where I'll do things like, hey, I wrote a shell script that can take a PDF and turn it into a really terrible EPUB so that you can put it on your phone and read. And it kind of works. It kind of doesn't. They get to see that stuff right away. So it's a real advantage for patrons. One of those zany, mad experiments, and I've talked about it here on the show before, but I like to bring it up every once in a while to kind of show it off, is my Dwarven Forge virtual tabletop back. So one of my side hobbies of tabletop role-playing games is Dwarven Forge. Dwarven Forge, in my opinion, make the best tabletop terrain for tabletop role-playing games. They make beautiful, really resilient, really like durable, hand-painted terrain for tabletop games. Really, really cool stuff. Also really expensive. It is not critical to have this stuff to run a great game, but it makes the game kind of fun when you're able to use it in the same way that really good miniatures are able to be able to do it. And so one of the things I said, wouldn't it be neat if, especially during COVID times, when I was running more online games and I was like sad that I have all this Dwarven Forge tabletop stuff, but I couldn't use it for my online games. And I was like, what if I could use it for online games? So early on in COVID, I was like, what if we put these backdrops in on virtual tabletops? What would that look like? And you can see I have some simpler designs that I made early on. I even did some top-down ones. I know there's a bunch of people who prefer the top-down style so that they can actually put miniatures on it and do the grid. But I kind of got away from that because I think that you really get the advantage of the 3 dimensions when you do an isometric view, when you do sort of a side view. So patrons of Sly Flourish get access to an album of these Dwarven Forge virtual tabletop backgrounds. I had sort of 2 inspirations for this when I was doing it. And one is there was a video game put out on iOS called Fantasian, which was done by the developers of Final Fantasy, done by, I think, the creator of Final Fantasy. And Fantasian is a very typical Final Fantasy game, only all of the backgrounds for Fantasian were actual physical models, right? That they were hand-done dioramas that had digital characters put over the top of them. And they're all like, here's an example of like one of the dioramas that the guy was actually painting that then is thrown in as a background photo in the game. And it makes these beautiful, like the game is this really beautiful game where you have these actual physical models for all of the backdrops. Even though you have digital characters, you can see like there's a physical model with a digital character over the top of it. And I was like, that's something we could do for our tabletop role-playing games. Now, why couldn't we have physical backdrops with digital tokens in our virtual tabletop? So that was the first idea. That was the first kind of inspiration. Another inspiration for this was something that Monty Cook had done a long time ago called Dungeon a Day. You can't find the website anymore. It's gone. But the way that Monty Cook was running this, it was sort of pre-Patreon, pre-Kickstarter. And he was like, if you subscribe to my service, then every day you'll get a chamber of a mega dungeon. And the way he did that chamber was with Dwarven Forge, that he had his own Dwarven Forge back then. And he would make a Dwarven Forge room and then describe what's going on in that room and give out one room a day as part of the Dungeon a Day thing. And I said, I'm not going to do like a Dungeon a Day, but I could do a scene maybe every couple of weeks. And the way that works is I'm running a home game and I use Dwarven Forge for my home game. And whenever I make a setup for my home game, I can take it and take a picture and make it a transparent ping and then put that in the album so that patrons of Sly Flourish can use these in their own displays. So like, here's an example of one that I did for my final battle for my Empire of the Ghouls game. So you can download your image. You actually download all of them. There's a nice thing. When you become a patron, you can grab the entire album, download it locally, you have it forever. You don't have to like stay, and hope that I keep the Patreon going forever or else you're going to lose access to this. Of course, I'm putting new ones up all of the time. Here's another cool example. I'm putting new ones up all of the time, but you can download all of them in one go. So we're going to use my favorite VTT owlbear and we're going to load up and we'll create a new, let's see, do I have a test room? I have a test room. I'll go to my test room here. And we are going to go to my asset manager. We are going to add a new asset. This is going to be a new scene. And we're going to, let's see, get my downloads here. And we drop it in. As you can see, it fits nicely. I think the grid is probably okay. We're going to make this one pretty big. So I'm going to make it we're going to try 64 columns by 48. But that might actually be too big. We'll see how that goes. But sometimes I kind of like the bigger one. Grid control, we're going to make it opaque and we're going to turn snapping off. We do not want to snap the grid. And we say import. And then we launch the scene. So here we now have the backdrop in and we can grab a character. Let's see. We'll go to the default tokens and we'll drop a token on there. And yeah, so in this case you can see like it's a little small. It's almost like every square is almost like a 10-foot grid. But you can put all the guys here that you want. So like we'll have our rogue and we'll have our barbarian. Barbarian's a little close to the edge. And we'll have like a fighter, right? And so you can put your tokens right over the top of it. And we can go into, and we'll go to our A5E tokens here. And we'll say ghoul. And we could put ghoul tokens on there. And we might have like demon. And we'll throw like a Balor. That guy's huge. Look at that. He was like a 25-footer. We're going to make him like 15 feet. There we go. Right? And so you can put your tokens right over the top and you can run your game. And you're like, well, what about distances and stuff, Mike? It's all, the isometric is totally throwing me off. Well, that's what you have your ruler tool for, right? And you can do your measure and you can say like, oh, how far can I go? Oh, it's 30 feet, right? 35 feet. You can do spell templates and stuff like that too. But you can use this backdrop. And the cool thing is you get this nice physical backdrop that is actual stuff that I used, actual templates that I use. And it gives like a whole kind of different fun style to the game that you want. So all of this is available. This whole photo library is available to patrons of Sly Flourish, along with all kinds of other stuff that you get for being a patron of Sly Flourish. But I really love doing them. I think they're really fun to make. They're fun to build. And really what I like is that I'm able to share them with more than just the players that I have at the table. Here's some simpler ones, like a tomb, an old cave that breaks into a tomb wall is one of them. Here's this is actually from City of Arches. I have a whole City of Arches, that whole segment are all the rooms from the Obsidian Skull City of Arches game that I ran. So neat stuff. And I just think it's fun to do. It's fun to look at. Here's a cool serpent shrine. It gives you the opportunity to experience Dwarven Forge backdrops without having to pay a ton of money to build a Dwarven Forge setup. So I hope you dig it, and check that out. It's available to patrons. And to patrons of Sly Flourish, again, thank you so much. I read a fantastic article from a writer who I've been reading a lot more from, Cory Doctorow. Cory Doctorow probably now is most known for inventing the term enshittification. You've heard me talk about this a little bit, and honestly, a lot of the conversations that I've had about how digital play has been changing in the world of tabletop role-playing games, the concerns that I have about it, the mitigations that I think we can put in place, a lot of that is coming because I'm reading Cory Doctorow talking about how bad things have gotten with other forms of digital entertainment and digital tools that we have, and how bad it's gotten elsewhere. It isn't nearly that bad in our hobby, and I don't want it to become that way, which is why I talk about it so much. Anyway, I really love his articles, but he wrote an article about a week ago that I read, which is so relevant to tabletop role-playing games. It even mentions tabletop role-playing games in the article. The name of his article is called Against Lore. And it has some spoilers for Furiosa, the movie Furiosa that just came out. And he talks about that. I skipped that part because I didn't want to have spoilers for Furiosa. But I had a feeling I knew what his point was. And he starts off with a really fun anecdote. And the anecdote is that he had a Navy veteran that he talked to and had a lot of experience with like gun lore. And so whenever Cory Doctorow was writing a novel where he talked about a gun, and he would say like, I don't know if he actually had this as a problem, but he was, that people who are gun aficionados would read what he would say about a gun and say, well, that's totally not how that works, or that can't work that way, or this other thing doesn't work that way, or that they would get into the technical details of what other gun stuff he was talking about in his book and tell him how wrong he was. And so this guy said, here's a way that you can solve that problem. Every time you mention a particular type of gun, just add the word modified to the front of it. So if you say like, hey, she picks up her AR-15 and sprays a hail of bullets into a car door, you just say she used her modified AR-15. And the minute you put modified in there, gun nuts would look at that and say, oh, and their heads would go like the meme of all of the calculations and stuff like that. And they would fill in the blanks of how it was modified to be able to accomplish the thing that it did in whatever the book was. So all you would have to do is add the word modified to the beginning, and it let the reader fill in the blank of what modified meant with whatever they were going on. An example, and so he talks about how important this idea of leaving blanks in fiction is, to let the imagination of the reader fill it in with their own stuff, and how powerful that is. Now, in the world of tabletop role-playing games, we know this a lot. Anybody who's sat around with creative players knows that creative players are bringing as much as you're bringing to make your game really fun. And it's because there's a lot of blanks. There's a lot of times where people can add their own stuff into the game. And we talk about things like knives, the concept of knives. A knife in an RPG is when a player hands you something in their backstory that you can grab and use as like a moment of tension, and I've been using it like crazy in my Shadow Dark games, that when characters have bits of backstory that you can grab onto and use, they kind of call it a knife because it's like the player is handing you a knife and then you stab them with it. That's a little bit much. But like many times it's like you can grab elements of their backstory and use it as moments of tension, or use it as kind of ways to challenge the player and challenge the characters, not in a mean way, but in a fun, creative way. And we do that because we have these blanks that we don't know all the backgrounds of the characters, but the players do, and they bring us stuff. So that whole idea about leaving blanks in our game, I think, is so powerful. And we don't think about it. A lot of times we're just doing it. Cory Doctorow does talk about it in the realm of tabletop role-playing games. He has this whole section on tabletop role-playing games. He's mostly talking about here kind of about how game masters are denying the thing that players want through like victory and treasure, and how he's kind of loosely talking about beats, like story beats kind of, but I think he misses the mark on this, because there really are ways that we leave tons of blanks, and the blanks that we leave in role-playing games I think are far more wide and useful than they are even when we're doing it in fiction. But like another example of like how this manifests in fiction, and one element to it, which I think is vital, is that we don't try to fill in those blanks ourselves, particularly if we try to do it after the characters or after the players have filled it in with what they've filled it in with. Don't go back and try to fix it afterwards. I'll give an example of this, and this is going to be controversial, and I'm going to get comments on the YouTube, and I guess I'll just deal. Don't worry, we don't have to have a deep conversation about this or not. But the example would be Star Wars. For those of us of a certain age who grew up with the original Star Wars trilogy, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, there were elements of lore that were put in those movies that were huge blanks. An example is the Clone Wars. It's mentioned, I think, one time. They mentioned the Clone Wars. Oh, you fought with my father during the Clone Wars. We didn't know anything about it. We didn't clone. Who were cloned? What clones? Clones? What's that? Right? No idea what's going on. We see things like Boba Fett, and we're like, who the hell's Boba Fett? Right? Where'd this guy come from? How's he so smart? Right? There's all of these blanks in the original trilogy. And we, for 20 years, again, those of us of a certain age, filled in those blanks with our own ideas. And there were comic books and there were novels and stuff that also kind of touched on it. And sometimes we liked those and sometimes we didn't. But a lot of times you're like, I don't know. I had my own idea about what the Clone Wars are. I had my own idea about who Boba Fett is, right? We had all these ideas that came from that lore because the lore had lots of blanks and we filled in those blanks with our own ideas. And then Lucas said, hey, I don't like your ideas. I'm going to make my ideas. And then he did Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And he made his 3 movies. And many of us weren't real big fans of it. And weren't big fans of it for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is we're like, all the clones are actually Boba Fett's dad? That's C-3PO was made by Darth Vader? That seems unlikely, right? And he filled in all of these blanks with stuff. And we're like, I don't like his, I liked mine. Now, what's interesting is you get other Star Wars fans of a certain age who really like the original movies, mostly because they were like 12 years old when they saw those movies. They hadn't spent 20 years filling in the blanks with their own stuff. There were no blanks. A lot of them saw the prequels before they saw the New Hope, which meant then they already had that stuff defined for them. There never was an opportunity to have those blanks, which is why that group likes those movies while other people, like mine of a certain age, don't like those movies. It's because where were the blanks left? Right, in these things. There are other blanks, like who the hell are the Sith? Where did they come from? What's the rule of 2? What, all these other elements that then are blank, and then they define those later. And then that, that can cause problems in other ways. The point is that when you leave blanks, you don't want to shake them up by filling in those blanks after your players have filled them in. So there's lots of interesting areas where these blanks manifest. But again, we're talking about tabletop role-playing games. So where do we see these blanks in tabletop role-playing games? I have an article that I'm working on for this. I'm going to kind of talk it through. Just described all those things. But here are some interesting ways that we can leave blanks in our own role-playing games that really matter. So an example are monsters descriptions. I screwed this up last week. I left a blank and it was great. And then I'm like, I filled it in. And the example was I was describing that the characters were in this deep cave and they were fighting a creature that they kind of recognized as a drider. That was easy for them. Like, oh, it's a half human, half spider guy, but he was unique. And then I said, and he's that there's these creatures in the shadows, and they have like spider-like heads with black eyes that are blinking at you suspiciously, and clackers that are clacking together, and they're sending rhythmic clacks that you think maybe if you understood their language you could pick up bits of it, but you can't because nobody speaks that. No human. And long arms with claws that are like dripping liquid, and big distended bellies, and walking on their hind legs. They weren't like spiders. They were like half humanoid, half spider things with weird bulbous bodies and heads full of, and the players are like, God, what the hell are these things? And then I wrote down, I said, Ettercap. And they went, oh, it's an Ettercap. Right? And immediately their heads were filling in details about what these crazy looking humanoids, half spider, half humanoid, the handmaiden keepers of this drider creature, this cursed half spider being that they were working with. And then I ruined it by saying, oh yeah, it's an Ettercap, right? And so describe monsters, don't label monsters would be an example. Talk about the huge hulking form standing 10 feet tall, wielding an axe that looks like it's made out of a carriage door, right? Or a club that looks like it weighs 200 pounds, drool dripping down from his tusks, tattoos covering half of his face. And you're like, what the hell's that? It's so much better. An ogre. You're fighting an ogre. Now you're fighting an ogre. Right? Good example. Like that to me is a real strong one. Leave blanks in the descriptions of your monsters so the players can imagine other horrible things going on. Unknown rituals. Sometimes the characters go in an area and they see symbols and runes and they want to understand it. And it's like, whatever this ritual is, it is beyond your capabilities to understand what they were doing here. And then the players fill in the blanks. A ghoul slaughterhouse. I had this in my Empire of the Ghouls game where I didn't want to describe what the slaughterhouse of Vandecool was like. So I said, over there is the slaughterhouse of Vandecool. You don't want to go there. Don't go there. And the player's like, we don't want to go there. Right. And because whatever was in their head about what's going on in the slaughterhouse of the ghouls, that was enough. A villain's dark past. Sometimes we just say, they come from parts unknown, right? Where did this villain arise from? What drove them to come to this? The players can fill in the blanks. We don't have to spell out the motivation for our villains. We might even have a motivation in our mind. We don't have to give it to the players. Let them come up with their own motivation. History of the world. A lot of times you can just sort of describe things and let the players describe it. You could talk about the War of the Obsidian Blade. Right? You are veterans of the War of the Obsidian Blade. What was that? What do you think it was? Right? And they go, I brought this one up to my wife and she immediately had like a 20-page backstory about the War of the Obsidian Blade. And I was like, see, you filled in the blank. Right? The smoky rifts to lands unknown. Maybe there's a great cleft and you can see smoky tendrils coming out of it. What's down there? Who knows? Dungeons deep. You can see sinkholes that are carving deep into the earth and you can see the remnants of constructed shapes down there, like old, masoned walls and things like that. Who built them and why? And how did they get so far down? Who knows? You leave it. Brutal scars. You might describe a guard captain as having a big scar across her nose and lip. And where'd you get that? She goes, I don't want to talk about it. Right? Fill in that blank. Histories of magic items. Sometimes you get an ancient sword wielded by primeval knights that have primeval glyphs along the edge. Well, what happened there? Right? The inner workings. This is one of my absolute favorites. The inner workings of diabolic machines, right? That you can do things like the weird smell of ozone, the sound of rushing water, heat vents that are blowing heat. My big favorite is describing machinery beyond the walls of a dungeon. And there's things moving back there that are enabling traps to operate. How do they work? Who knows? I'm not thinking about it, but the players know, there's counterweights and I hear water rushing. It's probably a water wheel and maybe that's generating something. You could have a blast of an arc of electricity and they go, what is that, right? You can describe these machines, the inner workings, without describing them. Blanks, man. The blanks are important. What are some other kinds of blanks? Blank spots on a map. You don't have to fill out the whole map. This is that whole points of light idea from 4th edition of let's have a map, but not fill out every hex. Not every hex needs to have something in it. That doesn't mean there isn't anything in the hex. It means that it hasn't been found yet. It hasn't been defined yet. Elements of history. There could be entire sections of history left blank where the history books just don't cover them. A dark age. What the dark age? Because all of the books were burned. Some say there was once a library that held all the history, but the books were scattered and the library is burned. And now we don't know anything about this time. Only that was a time of great darkness. Blank information behind factions. Right? Who are these different groups? How do they operate? Maybe we don't know. Maybe there's mysteries. Maybe they have inner rings of stuff. And then what are some blanks that we can throw to the players to help them fill them in? Campfire tales, one of my favorites that, you can say whenever they're taking a long rest, not every time necessarily, but sometimes you can say, where does your mind wander off to while you're sitting around the campfire? Does it head back to the past? Is there an element from your past that your mind returns to? Or are you thinking about where you're going to be in the future? What is your character thinking about while you're resting for that night? Or what are you talking about with the other players? How do you describe your killing blow? Describe your killing blow is one of my favorite things. When they kill a monster, tell me about it. They get to fill in the blank. That's a really good one. Physical characteristic of monsters. Describe an interesting physical characteristic of this monster that you're fighting. You can use that to identify the monster when you're doing more tactical combat. And also the players get to think more about what this monster is like that makes it unique. And one of my personal favorites at the end of the game is 1 year later, where is your character? Where does your Let's jump 1 year in the future. Tell me about where your character is now. You do this at the end of a campaign. I love doing this. Wow, if you ever want to see players grab on and fill in blanks that you had no idea, that you had no idea what they were going to do that at the end of a campaign. Ask them where their characters are 1 year later. Write it down. Keep it in your notes, because it's so nice to hear about where the characters went, and the players get to run so much stuff. Those are really good examples, in my opinion, about where blanks can fit into tabletop role-playing games and where they matter. The one thing I'd like you to walk away from this is the idea that you do not need to fill everything in, that you can leave lots of blanks in your own story, in the story you're telling, and leave it to the players to use their imaginations to fill in those blanks, because they're going to come up with really awesome stuff. Along with awesome stuff like Dwarven Forge tabletop backgrounds, exclusive adventures, dedicated Discord server to join the Lazy DMs community and helping support me and the work that I do, patrons also get access to the monthly Q&A. The monthly Q&A is a great way to ask any RPG-related question. I answer every question every Friday morning. I get my measuring cup full of coffee, and I sit and I answer those questions. Some of those questions make its way here onto the talk show. Other ones become the catalyst for other future articles or other videos that I shoot. Jason K says, I get the impression that you are a forever GM. Do you ever get to play on the other side of the screen? And if so, how does being a forever GM impact your play style? It's the whole concept of a forever GM is interesting. I've been playing D&D and RPGs for 35 years. And the whole concept of the forever GM really has only come up in the last 2 or 3, even though, yes, I have primarily been a forever GM. I don't really take that on as a label, though. I don't think defining myself as a forever GM does anything for me. And the answer is no, I still play. I mostly play when I'm going to like organized play games or I'm going to one-shot games. But my friend Chris ran a campaign for me recently for our normal group. And I got to play my first 5th edition campaign from first, I think we were like 9th level, 8th or 9th level. I don't remember how long we went. But I got to play for a while. And it was a blast. I really, really liked it. One of the things, so you ask, like, what was it like being on the other side of the screen? So one thing I've known about for one-shot games is my attention runs away pretty quickly, that I much prefer GMing because I'm always on. I'm not distracted when I'm GMing. I am really in flow, right? It's something that I've done for a long time. It is a complex task, and it meets all the elements of flow. If you want to learn more about flow, you can go check out flow on Wikipedia, read about that idea. The idea is you're doing a complicated task that you're good at. You sort of lose track of time. You are really invested and involved. It feels really good, and that's the way I feel when I GM. When I play, I'm not quite as on tap like that. But there were a couple of things that I did, advice of my own that I took on my own that helped. And one was I take notes. And I'll tell you, if you want to be a good player, number one thing you can do is take notes. Take notes about the game. Even if other players are taking notes as well, it is really, really helpful to everybody, but also to you, to just jot down what's going on in a game. You don't have to take like a huge journal entries. Bullets are fine. I just do little bullets of like what happens from scene to scene. And just keep your head around what's happening in the game. It helps you imagine what's happening in the game. It helps you stay on track. It keeps you busy. It keeps your hands busy. It's just a really good idea. I really think the number one thing players can do is take notes. But then some other advice that I picked up that I have given and that I did when I was running is I wanted to be a sidekick to another character. So I didn't want to be a main character. I didn't want to only worry about mine. I wanted to be supportive of other characters, which meant that like I sort of built relationships with other characters. I built, we had dialogue between other characters, and that really worked for me, and it made my game more fun. Also, picking mechanical options for your character that help boost other characters is another great way. You're going to be well loved by the group. You're going to enjoy doing it. It's really effective mechanically in the game. It's just, it's a good thing. So those are like 3 quick tips that I picked up that I did when I was running as a player. Taking notes, supporting other characters at the table, both in story and supporting other characters with mechanics. Choosing mechanics that helped other players, that helped other characters, rather than just trying to focus on like my own damage per round or whatever. Luke says, do you print out or make copies of the monster stat blocks that you'll be using in a given session? I was running the boss battle at Castle Orzelberg from Empire of the Ghouls yesterday, and I found myself doing a lot of flipping through the books, even after jotting down notes as many monsters of the issue. Any advice, in addition to printing everything out, that you could lend as to how to minimize this would be greatly appreciated. There is a killer tool that helps you with this. This is why I put this question in, because there's a killer tool that I really like. Adhesive tabs. Go to your local like drugstore or grocery store and look for adhesive tabs. Don't cheap out. Get good adhesive tabs. Adhesive tabs can go into a book. They don't damage the book. You put them on, you can peel them off, and you can put them in as like good bookmarks that aren't going to fly out whenever you're opening it. Some books have ribbons, and the ribbons can work too, but I find that adhesive tabs are a great way to take the physical book of monsters and mark the monsters that are going on. I don't make copies of stat blocks. I know many people do. If it works for you, that's great. I think it's sort of an element of prep that A, takes up time, B, takes up extra paper, and C, kind of railroads you towards running those monsters instead of running potentially other monsters. The nice thing about the adhesive tabs is you already have the book. You can just put the tab in there. Yeah, you're flipping back and forth. It's not that big a deal. The idea that we have to like super streamline our process during the game, I think we can hang on to that too tight. I think it's perfectly fine to flip through a book. I don't think anybody minds that much. Like, you know, and one way if you find yourself flipping through a book too much is run fewer monsters. Don't run so many different kinds of monsters. I get it when you're doing something like Castle Orgelberg where there's like 12 different kinds of monsters and you got like all these different things. Sometimes you can just say, you know what, I'm just going to reskin, especially like Darkul, right? Like there's Darkuls in Castle Orgelberg. I'm just going to use the same Darkul stat block, but I'll just name it different things, and I'll improvise some ability rather than having all these different ones. Because sometimes you look at monster stat blocks, and they really aren't that different from one another, and you can just make a slight modification and only have one stat block. But what I found is I use my physical monster books, and I use little tabs, and I use the adhesive tabs to mark the particular monster, and that way it's very easy for me to flip to that kind of monster. And I can move those tabs around even during the game so that I can switch from one set of monsters to another set of monsters very, very easily. And that gives me freedom to improvise which monsters I'm using in my game because all I have to do is move those tabs around. So get yourself, it's like $5, if $5 on the high end. And you can get like 20 adhesive tabs that you can then paste into your book and then peel off. And what I do is I actually take like 5 or 6 of them and I put them in the back cover of the book, like the cardboard cover of the book. I keep them in the book. And that way I always have those tabs in the book and I can peel one off and drop it on the monster. And that way I've got it right where I need it all the time. But also you can take another set of tabs and throw it in your GM kit. So if you have a book that doesn't have them, you have some extra spares. Good question, Luke. But yeah, adhesive tabs, super valuable tool. Joe S. says, how would you integrate fate and prophecies into a D&D campaign, Greek-style mythology style, without taking agency away from the players and the story feeling like it's set in stone? Really tough one. I put this question in because it's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer. And when you start to put fate and prophecy in, you are kind of railroading. Now, one thing you can do is sort of the magician's trick of building the fate and prophecy around the things that the players and the characters are already bringing. So once they've picked their direction, you can kind of use the fate and prophecy to say, that is of course how it was ordained, right? And you can drop in elements like they knew you were going to do that. And you're like, well, how did they know? I just made it up. And you're like, yeah, but they knew. There's a bit of this trickery in Curse of Strahd and in I6 Ravenloft where you have the characters drawing tarot cards to figure out their fate. But really what you're doing is determining where the thing is. And players who are experienced will all recognize that, wait a minute, we didn't draw cards, we didn't draw tarot cards to figure out where things were. We defined where they are because of those. And you take that same style and you can kind of have the fates sort of follow the characters. Now, the problem occurs if the characters are trying to figure out what the fate is before they've done something. And that one's not great. So in certain circumstances, this can be really hard because if you are defining the prophecy ahead of time, it's going to railroad them. There's no other way to do it. And this is one of the reasons like Theros wasn't a big book of mine that I want to run. I know there are people who are running Mythic Odyssey of Theros and love it. And I'm not taking any away from them. I didn't like it because I didn't want the gods that involved because I always feel like I just want the players to be doing character stuff. I don't really want the gods to be heavily involved. So in the same way, I would worry about bringing in fate and prophecies early. And instead, you're going to want to learn some of like the tricky fortune teller tricks of managing to get the fate and prophecies to actually change based on the actions that the characters do. So they have agency, but the agency that they take, the directions they take were known all along. So Not a fantastic answer, I know, but that's what I've got. Jason says, thanks for all your recent campaign tier rankings. That was very fun to do. That and all of the talk recently about short versus long adventures has really been making me think, probably because we're nearing the end of our current 2-year campaign. One thing that struck out to me about short versus long is what about medium-sized adventures? We really like those mini story arcs that last 8 to 12 sessions, maybe a level or two in experience and then move on. The equivalent, I suppose, is a single chapter in a large campaign book, but a chapter that completes the story. It seems we have a lot of layer books or one-shot adventures or the big campaign books. Perhaps I'm struggling because I'm not the most experienced or imaginative person, yet I want to create situations that our group likes and have been searching for those solutions. Not sure if this is more of a download of thought or if there's an actual question here. I think actually when we talk about short adventures, a lot of times we're talking about medium adventures. But to me, the really interesting thing is that we can often take short adventures and expand them out into medium adventures. I took like 12 pages out of Curse Scroll 1 from Shadowdark, for Shadowdark from Arcane Library, and now I'm hitting 31 sessions. We can often expand. I think it's pretty easy to expand shorter adventures because they're not all built as one-shots. There's actually not very many that are built as single-session games. A lot of those short adventures that we see are 2 to 4 sessions or something like that. They're not necessarily 8 to 12, but they're 2 to 4. But often we can expand them out. Sometimes we can combine a couple of them together. So if you're looking at like the Book of Layers or the various layer books that Kobold Press puts out, and I love those layer books. Those are really, really good. You want books of short adventures that are really kind of easy to drop in. Check out all of the various layer books that Kobold Press has put out. They tend to put them out whenever they put out a monster book, and there's usually like 10 or 12 layers. I've written a couple of them. They have Eldritch layers. They have Tome of Beasts 3 layers. There's just a bunch of underworld layers for Empire of the Ghouls, lots of these like short adventures. And the nice thing is you can often take 2 or 3 of them and mash them together and turn them into one of these mini campaigns. Also, another book is Radiant Citadel, the book of short adventures that Wizards of the Coast put out. The Radiant Citadel books, Radiant Citadel Adventures, have whole miniature campaign settings for each one of the adventures. So you can run the adventure that's there, but you can also expand it out into the campaign setting that each of those adventures had. It's really, really cool, and I highly recommend checking it out. Radiant Citadel did a fantastic job of building a single short adventure plus a miniature campaign setting that you could sort of set your adventure in. So they're out there, but I think instead of kind of hoping that a product solves your problem for you, you can instead take the products that exist and build them out. I've also talked about this. Shadowed Keep of the Borderlands is a level 1 to 5 adventure. It kind of hits this idea of being 8 to 12 sessions. I think it's one of my favorite adventures of all time. I really, really love it. It is one of my favorite adventures of all time. I don't know if it's the favorite, but it's one of my favorite adventures of all time. And it does a perfect job of exactly what you're talking about. It is a short campaign. It's got a small setting. It works really well. So if you're looking for stuff like that, I would check that out. I would also check out Curse Scroll 1, 2, and 3 for Arcane Library. Even though they're written for Shadowdark, you could easily convert them to 5e. Or you could play Shadowdark, because Shadowdark's really good. There's lots of different things. And Journey Through the Radiant Citadel, I think, would be another book where the adventures include mini campaign settings that you could use to flesh out your thing. It's really, really, really good. Alex W. says, it sounds like you have a strong group of players in terms of respect and maturity, but I have a couple of players who are great folks, but are right on the edge of pushing it. From criticizing my lack of funny voices, I am more of a descriptive role player, to use the A5E term, to not characterizing NPC monsters correctly. I had Cryovane accept the offering, which is apparently something dragons don't do. While I do those things that aren't actually my shortcomings as a DM, how could I address these tiny jabs swiftly in-game without losing focus or losing on the other player's buy-in? I think they call those microaggressions, right? I think that's, we refer to those as microaggressions these days. And this falls into a very large typical category of probably time to sit down with whoever's doing this and having a conversation with them. I think trying to necessarily address it at the game may not be the best place to address it. I think instead you could have a conversation with them, hopefully like as close to in person as you can do it. If online, please say like, hey, can we talk about this in a chat? I don't want to just, you're going to want to send texts back and forth. You're going to want to send direct messages. Don't do that. Instead, have a real conversation with them. It's harder to do, but it's more important. And tell them how you feel about this. Hey, whenever I'm running a game, I notice every so often you'll kind of pick on these things, and you'll say these things. And I don't know that you probably just think it's like joking, but it actually kind of throws me off because like I'm in the middle of kind of trying to run a good game and it's hard for me and it throws me off. So I'd really appreciate it if you didn't do that. And I hope you understand the effort that I'm putting into this game. And I know that it may not be the perfect style that you like, this is the style I've got. So if you hold those comments to yourself, I'd really appreciate it, right? And then, and if they go, I don't even know what you're talking about, say, well, I'll tell you what, whenever you do something like this, if you do it, I'm going to do this at you, right? And when I do this, that means you're doing it. And I'm asking you to stop, right? I don't know if that's a great idea, but I think that, like, having the conversation with your player and tell them how it makes you feel helps, right? Talk about the situation. You don't have to be like accusatory, like you're making me feel bad. Like just say like, when you say these things, this is how I feel about it. These are like hard conversations we have to have in our life anyway. We have them in our jobs, we have them at home, we have them in all kinds of places, but we have to do it in our games too, because there are a bunch of people sitting around and they might think they're just having fun and it's fun, but you got to kind of stop and say, hey, I would really appreciate if you wouldn't do this. Like it would help me out. It would help me run the game. It helped me have more fun. Because when you say stuff like that, I kind of losing my drive like I'm losing the fun that I'm having. So I'd appreciate it. And when you kind of bring it that way, hopefully they'll go, wow, okay, I didn't really think about that, right? And then it could go bad too. And they could be like, oh, look, I'm Mr. Sensitive here. And you're like, okay, I think you need to find another game, right? So the alternative is like, if they don't respect that, they might need to find another game. Right. And that's taking it pretty far, but hopefully that helps. So Alex, and I think that I'm bringing this one up, but there are many circumstances that are like this. There are many times when players are doing a certain thing and you just need to have a conversation with them outside of the game, one-on-one, as close to in-person as you can get, to say, here's the situation. Here's where I need it to be in order for me to have fun with the game. Can we get there? Right? I think that can work. Dawson J says, I'm curious if you ever find yourself struggling to commit the time to run a game, and how do you get over that hump? I'm trying to get back into running games, but keep finding myself questioning how committed I can truly be to running a game. I even try to put together a one-shot and then back out because I feel like all my prep and time invested for it will be wasted since it's just a one-shot. Looking for some wisdom to get over the idea that everything I do has to be an epic year-long game or nothing. This is a tough question, and I'm in a different spot because pretty much every waking moment, every waking moment of my life is dedicated to this hobby, right? I have my spouse is dedicated to the hobby too. And, so for us, like I'm running 2 to 3 games a week. What's interesting is I know people that run like 4 or 5 or 6 games a week and they manage that. And I'm like, I can barely get 3. Like when I'm running 3 games, that's as much as I can really run. And I don't want to run 3 games a week regularly. I can really only run like 10 games a week is my limit, or 10 games a month is my limit, right? When I'm running more than that, I'm overdoing it. I got too much. And of course, I'm going to pitch it because it's my book, but Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master's intention is to help you kind of spend less time prepping your game and make a more fun game at the same time. But I get it, like not all those steps work for everybody. And we certainly get involved in sort of like feeling like we don't have everything we need. And that's something we really have to kind of work through. And when you talk about the amount of effort that you're doing to prep a one-shot game, really look at that prep. And I bet this is true. A lot of our prep is trying to manage the anxiety that we have about running a game for our friends, period. That we are putting ourselves in a vulnerable position when we run a game. We're being creative. We're being kind of childlike. We're diving into this, and we think we have to like really make it the best we can make it, or else they're just all going to laugh at you, right? Like from Cory, they're all going to laugh at you. And that's why we do a lot of the prep that we do, is that we feel like we'll get made fun of, or that we'll be met with scorn. And our players want to have a good time too. And the more we recognize that our players are our friends and they want us to enjoy the game, I know it's hard. We can hear that and it doesn't necessarily change how we feel. But we need to take the anxiety that we feel about that prep, recognize that it's not actually anxiety that we aren't prepared, and it's really anxiety about trying to run a good game for our friends, and say, and bring to ourselves, our friends want us to have a good time. Do I really have the things that I need? What is the bare minimum I need to actually run this game? If I only had 30 minutes to prep, what are the things I would spend that 30 minutes of prep time on? What do I have to have in front of me? Visualize yourself at the game and ask yourself what you really need. And then try to focus on that. And that hopefully can maximize the time and energy and effort that you're putting in to do your prep. And then recognizing that, like, once you've done that prep, you can say, like, of course I'm anxious about the game that I've got, but I recognize that's just general anxiety, and these are my friends and we're going to have a good time. Like, I've got a game happening in a half hour, right? And I feel that way. Oh, I want to make sure it's fun. I want to make sure my players have a good time. I want to make sure I have a good time. But I've got what I've got, and I think it'll probably be okay. Friends, I want to thank all of you for hanging out with me today when we talked about all things in tabletop role-playing games. If you enjoyed this show and you want more stuff like this, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. It is absolutely free to sign up. There is a link in the show notes. You get an adventure generator PDF for free for signing up, and every week you get an RPG-related article with links to all of the other work that I do on all the various other places of the interwebs. You can also become a patron of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to cool, new features like the Dwarven Forge VTT backdrops, tools to help you run your games, digital tools to help you run your games, tips and tricks for running your games, the awesome Lazy RPG community that we have over on the Discord server, and you help me put on shows like this. And you can pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Workbook, the Lazy DM's Companion, Forge of Foes, the Fantastic Books, coffee cups, t-shirts, all kinds of great stuff that you can get on the Sly Flourish bookstore. All of the best work that I have put out for this hobby you can find in those books. Thank you all so much. Have a great day and get out there and play an RPG.